Yes. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Penn TESOL East for August. So happy to have you come on this summer evening when things are pretty much, slow. We appreciate taking your time to be with us. But before we get started, I have a few announcements. So the first is our September webinar. Our guest speaker will be Jackie McCafferty, who is the director of the Center of American Language and Culture at Temple. So we're excited to have Jackie, and she'll be answering your questions in an Ask Me Anything session about institutional advocacy, which is defined as, and Bill could probably do a better definition in here, but as the outreach and services provided to campus as a whole, so our expertise is seen and acknowledged. So we will have that. We're happy to have Jackie with us in September. In October, we will have Virginia Pantella, who will be speaking about supporting ELLs linguistically in content courses from both the perspective of the ESL teacher and the content teacher. Her session will include strategies to help teach content clearly, regardless of the language learner's level. And of course, in November, this is where you need to mark your calendars, we'll be having the Penn TESOL conference at Temple University. Yay! This year's theme is a great one, as always, teaching with purpose, building connection and community. So early bird registration is open from now until October 14th with a discounted price of $50 for members. So be sure to register before then because prices will go up October 15th. It's something you don't want to miss. The conferences are a wonderful way to network and get to know each other. So also, the call for proposals is open. This year, we'll be accepting presentations, workshops, papers, and posters and panels. So please send those in right away. And you could do this at, and Bill will put the address, penntesoleast.org. That's penntesoleast.org. So for the call for proposals. So please be sure to do that. Also, one last, mark your calendar for Friday, November 13th, for an evening or a pre-conference gathering with speaker and networking sessions. This sounds like a great opportunity. So we'll have more details to come with that. So a lot of speaking and networking for this pre-conference gathering. So without further ado, I'll have Bill go on and Kate introduce Kate. But also I want you to say, please, during Kate's presentation, please put in your questions in the chat. And then as we go along, I'll be, entering those questions, and then we will continue on from there. So, welcome.
All right. Hello, everyone. I am Bill Albertson. I am a board member here at Penn TESOL East, and I am the co-chair of the webinars committee. And it is my honor this evening to introduce to you my friend and colleague, Kate Tomaskovic. Kate and I have been working together for a long, long time. We started working together at Drexel University, where she was my partner in curriculum crime. We wrote curriculum together, we worked together, and we taught together, and Kate is one of the absolute best teachers that I know. Some of you may know Kate from her work at the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education, where she taught the TESOL practice course for many years, and many of you served as mentors for students in the program where you were corresponding with her. Kate has produced many, many amazing teachers. So her work in the classroom goes beyond just what she does in the classroom, but also to what her students do in the classroom, and honestly, what her friends and colleagues do in the classroom. I credit a lot of what I do in the classroom to my friendship and connection with Kate, who is always there to be a sounding board to bounce ideas off of. For the past, 5 years now? It might have been longer,
Yeah,
5 or so years.
Linguistics.
6 years. Kate has been the Director of International Student Services at the Foxcroft School in Virginia. So that's a boarding school where she lives full time with her students, which is very exciting, supporting them linguistically in everything they do. And so Kate is going to talk to us today about some of her classroom strategies and impact your classrooms, hopefully. Kate, it's all yours.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much to Bill for inviting me to be here with everybody tonight. And thank you for taking the time to come and hear a little bit about lesson planning. I think I'm going to share my screen. It's been a while since I've used PowerPoint, so bear with me. Okay. So as you probably saw from all the advertisements, my presentation tonight is going to talk a lot about why your PPP lesson plan, which I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with, is actually missing half of the picture, even though it is probably the most popular lesson plan structure when we go through our TESOL training courses. So to start off, this is both for new teachers, if you are just starting out with your own classroom, if you're student teaching, if you just got out of a teacher training program, this is a great framework to start with, but also for experienced teachers. This could be a great diagnostic lens to audit the lessons that you are already making on autopilot. And it can also be a great coaching tool for mentoring. If you are still mentoring Penn students, could be great for them, but also for mentoring colleagues as well at your institutions. So hopefully what you want to walk away with by the end of this session is a research-grounded template that you can use, built on Nations for Strands and also supported by the literature. It's also going to go with probably a worked sample lesson that you can kind of see how the flow of the activities can go. And if anybody questions, why are you going to be introducing this framework to our institution, we also will give you a rationale to defend it. So just a quick question for everyone to pop in the chat. If you're thinking back about your teacher training days or getting thrown into the ESL classroom, the language classroom, how were you trained to plan a lesson? Again, I'm not going to assume everyone was trained in PPP, but it's nice to get a sense of who actually was trained in PPP. So throw it in the chat. And I can see. Okay, yep, so definitely some PPP. So just keep on going. The trouble with PPP alone, which if you're not familiar with PPP, stands for present, practice, and produce. It feels very simple. It's very teachable. It's easy to observe and evaluate. And that's why teacher training programs love it. Because they can easily see when they're looking at somebody's lesson, oh, you had a presentation stage where you presented the material. And then you see the students practice the material. And then the students were producing the material. So in theory, this sounds and looks great. There are some misconceptions which also can clue us in to why PPP is kind of a popular methodology, especially with that production at the end. A lot of us also are very familiar with communicative language teaching as being kind of the be-all of what we want to ground our lessons in. And there's kind of two misconceptions here. So a lot of people say, well, communicative language teaching means we don't teach grammar, or communicative language teaching means only teaching speaking, and that's how we're going to frame our PPP. Which these are actual misconceptions because there are tons of different definitions and descriptions of communicative language teaching. So there can also be this widespread failure to implement communicative language teaching in a meaningful and lasting way. So this also makes PPP break down in practice because grammar and vocabulary are often presented kind of in this isolation and disconnected from real input in that presentation stage. Production can also just be this controlled practice and not genuine communication. Also in PPP, there's no explicit space for fluency. So students just never get to use the language at speed. And it's not just this novice problem. Even experienced teachers will default back to PPP when we just don't have the bandwidth to start planning other things. Going back to that first misconception, that false dichotomy with communicative language teaching versus teaching explicit grammar. Again, that myth, communicative language teaching and explicit grammar instruction are opposites. You can do either one or the other, but if you're doing explicit grammar, you're not doing communicative language teaching. But most communicative language teaching methods do encourage this explicit grammar teaching, but they actually want you, instead of doing explicitly, they just want you to do it implicitly, kind of embedded inside a meaning-based activity. So we also have heard about focus on form. And so that's kind of how they tried to solve this. So grammar instruction integrated within meaning-based communicative activities, but intentionally targeting accuracy of specific forms. We love the idea of focused on form because it does produce a faster rate of learning and higher levels of ultimate attainment than instruction without it. And also, we do know that without form-focused instruction, some language features never emerge. And some non-target features persist for years without that form-focused instruction. Okay. And also, focus on form only works if meaning stays primary. So we want to maintain that primary focus on meaning. We have our explicit instruction, which can be front-loaded, but then there might not be any clear guidance for when or how to blend it with what we already know. And then we have this meaning-based work, which is only in the final stage. So we're still having these gaps. So even if we know, oh, focus and form is really important, there's still kind of no way to tell, well, how do we actually put all of these pieces together, especially if we also want to focus on meaning. Okay. And then we also hear a lot about tasks and how tasks are not activities, and how this is just a common trap, the false positive. So tasks, especially with that task with a capital T, is always going to be focusing on that meaning and focusing on meaning over form. And we know that tasks have a specific purpose and a goal for interaction, and that tasks can be completed without teacher assistance. But then again, we also hear about integrated skills. Integrated skills need to develop the skills in parallel fashion, not just tasks that happen to use more than one skill. So when we have our students do tasks, they might be using different skills all at the same time, but we might not necessarily be developing those skills along with the focus on meaning that we are also focusing on. So that's a lot going on in our language classroom. Because again, we want to do communicative language teaching. We want to also focus on form. We want to do tasks. We also need to do integrated skills. So coming into our classroom as a language teacher, we have all of these things and all of these theories being thrown at us at things that we know that we should be doing, but how can we just start to get a handle on how can I do all of these things well and also help my students? So I will answer that problem momentarily, hopefully. Going back to PPP, we have 3 flavors of PPP. So some of us have done just the straight present, practice, produce. Some people, again, if they're like, well, I really want to focus on that meaning first. So I can actually flip my PPP. I'm going to start with production. We're going to focus it in that context, in that environment, and show students kind of the gap between, okay, what do I want to be able to do? And what do I want to do? What am I able to do? And then once I notice those gaps, then we're going into present, and then we're going into practice, and then we're going to produce again. And that also sounds great. Or we also have that patchwork of PPP, where maybe we're going to present and we're going to practice. And maybe I see that there are some gaps. So I'm going to present again and we're going to practice. And maybe we're going to produce, but then I see some more gaps. So we're going to go back to presentation and then practice and then produce again and keep cycling as needed. And again, They seem good, but they're still not necessarily focusing again on those tasks, integrated skills. So it's getting a little bit better. But PPP still has these limitations that we just are not quite getting the whole entire picture of what we know that we're supposed to be doing with our students. And that is just because PPP was never meant to carry the whole entire lesson. PPP is really great for a lesson stage that focuses on these language forms within a larger lesson, especially if we do want to do integrated skills in our classroom. So PPP really should never have been asked to be the structure for the entire lesson. It is a great tool, but we also have other tools. So again, the upshot, we don't have to throw PPP away. PPP stages are valid, they are essential, but again, when we're talking about that integrated skills development, they just don't inherently support this type of development. So we are not going to throw it away. We are just going to give it a bigger frame to live inside. So what is that frame? This is where Nation's Four Strands comes in. So Bill knows I am a pollination super fan. Love pollination in every way. And he introduced the four strands in actually 1991. He actually created the four strands in order to structure a whole curriculum kind of over the course of a whole course. But I think we can actually take his idea and use it as a lesson framework. So not just using it as kind of a huge framework for the whole entire course to develop all four skills simultaneously, but we can also use it as a lesson framework and then also fit PPP in. So let me explain. What are Nation's four strands to begin with? He first talks about meaning-focused input. So we know input, we are receiving language. So that's our text, whether it's reading or listening text. So it's learning through reading and listening to messages. His second strand is language-focused learning. So that is the explicit, deliberate study of language features. That's grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, all of those language systems that we know in our classroom. Our third strand in Nation's Four Strands is our meaning-focused output. So again, learning through speaking and writing, so producing language. And then his fourth strand is fluency development, which he also said was really important, with no new information, just becoming fluent with what learners already know. And that could be in reading, writing, listening, or speaking, because fluency is not just about speaking. We can say fluency and talk about speaking in a very specific way, but we also need to develop reading fluency, listening fluency, writing fluency, as well as just that speaking fluency that we might be more familiar with. So Nation's original claim with his four strands is that a well-balanced course gives equal time to each strand over an entire program of study. So equal time to input, working with listening and reading, equal time to language-focused instruction, another set of equal time to speaking and writing, meaning focused output, and another set of equal time to fluency development in all of the skills. So that was his original intention, but tonight's adaptation takes those four strands and sequences them within a single lesson, and it's a deliberate departure. So yes, we can still use it as the whole course, but let me explain why it makes such a good lesson structure as well. So first of all, he starts with that meaning-focused input. So we know also from the literature that students need to receive language before they can produce it. So this is supported by Chastain, Harmer, Nation, and McAllister. Written or oral input should come before learners are expected to produce those same language targets. We can't expect students to produce something that they have never seen or heard before. Of course, people will push back saying, well, you can't separate out the skills. That's totally against the collaborative nature of meaning making. Yes, receptive productive may be a simplified lens, but it's a great, useful initial framework, especially for teachers who are still building their confidence in doing their lesson planning. So I'll just leave it at that. Okay, and then since receptive needs to come before productive, these 4 strands also fit really nicely into those 2 frames. Students are receiving in meaningful input, and also they are receiving through language-focused instruction. Bill knows that I like to talk about this as meaningful input is when you take a really nice picture of this beautiful garden landscape. And so that is, okay, I'm going to create this garden, or I'm going to take a picture of this garden. And language-focused instruction is when you can, now on our cell phones, zoom in that garden picture. And okay, this is the whole garden that I see. I'm going to zoom in on this sunflower. And we're going to focus on this sunflower. It's part of the whole, but this is what we're going to study today. So again, they are receiving that from the input. So it's not necessarily meaningful input, and then we're going off doing something else for language-focused instruction. You're still using that input, either that written or that oral text, and focusing in your language-focused instruction on that text. After that language-focused instruction, they would move to those productive skills. So after language-focused instruction, we're going to go either through speaking or writing for our meaningful output. And then we can also move into fluency development. And fluency development could be just taking what you did for that output, and now we're pushing for speed. Maybe it's going to be writing speed, maybe it's going to be speaking speed, maybe it's going to be practicing a skill. We'll also talk about how this can work with skills-based instruction as well. But some type of strand where you're not going to introduce any new information, we're just going to work with what we have learned in that class. Or we can even put fluency development at the beginning of the next class to do a review, but no new information in that strand. Okay, so why does this work? It is a great model for structural curriculum planning, especially in a task-oriented learning environment where you definitely want to use tasks, but you also want to make sure that your students are prepared to engage meaningfully in the task and have all of the tools that they need. So by using this framework, moving from receptive to productive, meaningful input, language-focused instruction, meaningful output, and fluency development, it has already prearranged where each skill and strategy belongs in your lesson. It removes that guesswork that novice teachers face when the skills are kind of taught in isolation or trying to fit it in somewhere. And it gives every teacher a built-in way to self-check their lesson balance. So they can see, how much time am I spending on the input stage with this text? How much time am I spending on language-focused instruction and explicit instruction? How much time did I give my students for that meaningful output? Is it more balanced, or is one strand completely dominating and I'm not having enough time to really dig into the other strands? Maybe I've spent way too much time on that receptive and I'm really rushing them through that productive. So it gives you a chance to audit yourself as well. So if we're looking at the lesson arc in full, we have our pre-task and meaningful input. And again, I'm sure if you've gone through your teacher training programs, any type of text that you're using comes with that pre-task. So again, kind of setting the scene, priming, maybe pre-teaching some vocabulary. You're still doing your gist. You're still doing your detailed questions, just so that you get a sense of, okay, what is the meaning of this text? So we still have those things that are happening with the meaningful input. So we're still following, good lesson structure there. Then by the time you've finished working with that text, everyone is comfortable with the meaning, the context, the situation. Now it's time where we can move on to that second stage and really focus in on that language-focused instruction. And here is where PPP can go really well with our meaningful input. So again, you have that input, you have that picture, you're going to zoom in and you're going to see, okay, this is the structure that we are going to do today. And you don't necessarily have to always do that present, practice, produce. If you want to start with that production, once you have that input, sure, see if students have kind of noticed some things, or start with a practice, or start with noticing, or immediately go into a presentation. So you still have that flexibility with PPP to work with your students, and you're still going to present that language feature, whether it's grammar, pronunciation, or vocabulary. You're still going to practice it from more controlled to less controlled. And you can even start to produce it in kind of a free practice in this stage as well. Or you can move that free practice to your meaningful output, depending on kind of your time of your lesson, what you want them to do, whether or not you have a task laid out for them for the meaningful output. So you still have a lot of flexibility, but you still have enough of a guideline to make you feel comfortable that you are filling in and giving your students the support that they need to get to that meaningful output. So maybe your meaningful output is that task with a capital T that you want them to do. Then once you give them the task, you can feel more confident that they have seen the example of the input. You've zoomed in, you've studied the language that you really want them to use and practiced it, and now you've given them the task. And then, of course, fluency development, you might play some games, or you might push them for speed, or you might repeat the task again, depending on what kind of task it is, and just to get that fluency, or give them that opportunity to develop their fluency.
Kate, sorry to interrupt. So I have a couple questions here for you.
Yes.
I'll start with one I feel is a pointed question. This is from Barb. Do you feel the PPP lesson planning tool is easier to adapt to receptive rather than productive, or can it be used for all 4 strands?
I think it's not necessarily adapting it. I think PPP fits into the 4 strands, just in that language-focused instruction part. So if you have a PPP lesson, obviously you feel like you have the language structure that you want to introduce. So then you would just make sure, okay, do I have a text before that shows either, again, a listening text or a reading text that shows that language in meaningful use? And then you just go from that meaningful input with that text into that PPP nested structure.
Okay. One more. I just want to ask before you get on. In fluency development, do you do any feedback for accuracy or only in meaning focused output? Then I'll let you continue.
Oh, that's a great question. I feel like the feedback mostly is in the output stage for that particular language structure, because in fluency development, we are pushing for speed. So I would not necessarily do immediate feedback in fluency development, but I do like to do feedback kind of post fluency development. So that's the kind of place where if students were doing a task, or I was pushing for fluency development in speed, if there were errors that were kind of popping up again and again, those are the types of things I might put on the board, like, oh, I heard this. These are some things that we need to change, and then have the students try to self-correct. And if it was clear that these errors were popping up and the students were having trouble self-correcting from what I heard throughout the task, then that would be a good indication for me that, okay, in our next class together, then we might need to revisit some of these things. So because I've already gone through the meaningful input and the language-focused instruction in this class, I don't necessarily need to go through those first 2 stages again. Maybe I'll just start with a practice of the errors that I've noticed.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess I'll keep going. Okay, so how does this work in kind of a real classroom with an actual lesson? This is just a very, very basic structure of a framework. So happy to talk through other things. But for example, let's say we're doing a pre-task with meaningful input. My whole goal with meaningful input is to expose my students to that target language in context. So before the target language is named or explained. It could be an authentic text, or it could be a graded text. Again, we want that I+1 input. We don't want it to be too difficult. We want our students to understand about 90% of that input, so that 10% is the only new language, so that we can actually use the text. And in meaningful input, all of our tasks are just comprehension focused. So, for example, I know that many of us work with adults. So maybe our students are watching a short video of two coworkers negotiating a schedule change, and maybe they are just going to be doing a graphic organizer, tracking who is asking for what. So at this point, they're watching the video, they're listening, they're just taking comprehension focused notes just to figure out what is going on, who is saying what in terms of what they want. It's only when I get to stage 2 that I'm going to be pulling the target structure or the vocabulary directly from that video input. And then I'm going to be running that compressed PPP cycle. So for example, from the video, I want to isolate maybe these gambits. Like, would you mind? I was wondering if, so any type of negotiation language that I explicitly want them to start learning and using in my next stages, because that's going to be part of my objective for that lesson, that is what I want them to zoom in on. So maybe I'm going to zoom in on them by having them highlight okay, how are they, what do they say when they're asking for something? Or can you put a box around, okay, what do they want? And they put a box around that. What do they say before they say exactly what they want? And then have them highlight these types of beginner language to lead into saying what they actually want. Then again, I'm going to make sure that all of those phrases, we want to go over the meaning of them. We want to look at those forms and then go from a gradually controlled practice onto the freer practice. So I'm still going to be doing my controlled practice with guided exercises. I'm not just going to immediately have them highlight and then expect them to be able to use these phrases. So I still want them to go through a PPP cycle. But I do know that they have at least been exposed to the language in a meaningful text, and we are using that same text to really zoom in on those structures. And then maybe at the end of my PPP cycle, maybe they're producing in a semi-controlled task, so I can see if they are ready to move on to that meaningful output stage. If I don't feel like by the semi-controlled task they are ready to move on to that meaningful output stage, I'm not going to move on to the meaningful output stage. I'm going to maybe, again, do that patchwork of PPP. Okay, I'm seeing that they're making these errors. We need to go back to a more controlled practice. We need to do another drill of this. We need to do some more pronunciation of these before we're ready. So you can definitely put a lot of the feedback parts in this stage. But then when you're ready to go on to meaningful output, then that's what you do. So the meaningful output, oh, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. I have
Yeah.
another question.
Mhm.
I think you could guess who this is from. When you say a semi-controlled task, what exactly is it? Is this one of Pica's 5 tasks, for example, or something a bit more open-ended?
Great question. So I like to think of controlled practice as there is only one right answer. So it's kind of easy to check. But then semi-controlled, there's a little bit of flexibility. So students are actually going to be able to fill in. They have a little bit of freedom with what they finish that phrase, or like maybe they have some choice. So there's still a little bit of structure. I'm still providing part of the language for that task, but I'm asking students then to fill it in. The controlled practice is very much going to be, okay, you got this right, you got this wrong, you got this right, you got this wrong. So there's only one answer. So if it's a matching exercise, there's only one right answer to that. If it's a conjugation exercise, like a close exercise, there's only one right answer. If it's a finish the sentence exercise, maybe I'm starting it and I'm giving them that, but I'm asking them, okay, now that you've learned some of these phrases, what makes sense to finish that phrase with? So if I'm asking them to start practicing the beginning of these requests and negotiations, maybe I'm going to fill in the second part of the sentence, and maybe there's going to be kind of a structure, especially with those if clauses. So I need to make sure that they know if they can use an if clause at the beginning, or if they're going to need to use another type of clause with that sentence, with the language that I'm giving them. So I want to make sure that they're noticing what they're able to do to make a complete sentence or a complete thought that would make sense in the context. And then, of course, that freer practice is I'm relinquishing even more control and giving them the reins a little bit more.
Right.
Right. So with our meaningful output, again, this is where, like I said, I'm relinquishing control. They are allowed to do their communicative tasks, so they have a real purpose. It's some type of either information gap, jigsaw, completable without teacher scaffolding. But I want to make sure that it requires the language that they just practiced in that language-focused instruction stage. So for example, if they're going to do a role play, then they have to request a deadline extension from a professor using at least 2 polite request forms from stage 2, and they have to negotiate a real outcome. So maybe they have their role cards. We know that one of them wants this, the other one wants this. How can they negotiate together to reach an outcome? So that is the goal. And then we move to that fluency development. So again, this is probably the stage that some people feel like, okay, I definitely want to finish my lesson with this. But again, since our objectives for our lessons mainly focus on what they're going to do in that meaningful output stage, I think fluency development is a great thing that we could include either at the end of the lesson, or it could be a great way to begin your next lesson with a review because it's no new information. And then you can also do like a repeated time pressure in speaking or writing task. That's just about automaticity. Question?
Hey, this is a good one.
Yeah.
Barb states, I enjoy using role plays, but I have noticed that they can go off on a tangent very easily. Do you have any advice on how to keep them on target while using the language learned?
Such a great question. Again, I'm not the hugest fan of role plays. I actually prefer something that's more problem solving, which again, sometimes role plays are really the only way that you can kind of get them to actually use the language that you want them to use. But sometimes I'll do, instead of a role play, it's kind of the two of them working together against not the computer per se, but for example, like matchmaking. So especially for like negotiating, it's not necessarily a role play in a situation, but I like to do kind of a matchmaking activity where I have the person I cut out from the magazine and I make them a dating profile, and then you have like the 2 matchmakers, and then they're each trying to figure out who's going to be the best one for that. And so they have to like make a decision together. So they're not necessarily putting themselves in a context, which sometimes in a context, I find that some of the learners can get a little silly and get off on tangents that way. But if it's kind of a problem solving or a decision making, solving the problem or making the decision kind of helps guide them a little bit more than just putting them in a situation which they may or may not take seriously. Alternatively, instead of doing 2 people in a role play, I sometimes like to do groups of 3 where their evaluation of their success is actually judged by that third person has that rubric and is specifically listening. Does this person do this? Do they do this? Do they try this? And so having that third person as kind of that buffer and evaluator sometimes can help keep the other 2 contained. But I think those are my only 2 solutions to the off-track problem.
That's a great question.
Yes, it was. So yeah, for fluency development, another great example just for people who are trying to conceptualize what this might look like. It could be a 4-3-2 speaking activity. So maybe they're explaining when they made a request, a polite request, or negotiated something to a partner. And so they have to tell it to 3 different partners. The first time they have 4 minutes to do it. The second time they have to do it in 3 minutes. And then the last time they have to complete the same task in 2 minutes. So again, we're just pushing for speed and automaticity here. There's no new teaching, no new language. It's just repeating the same thing.
Yeah, I thought it was the
Did someone have a question?
Oh, yeah. Well, could you type it in the chat and then I could go ahead. We're gonna do a open free for all here in a few minutes after Kate is done. If you don't mind just putting in the chat and I will direct it to Kate.
Thank you.
Thank you. But
Okay, so the next thing we always hear, okay, well, I know that I'm teaching vocabulary. I know I have to teach grammar. I know I have to teach pronunciation. So those are all of the language systems that fit really well into PPP. But beyond grammar and vocabulary and pronunciation, we also know that somehow we are also supposed to be teaching these language skills. So reading skills, listening skills, speaking skills, and writing skills. And I actually think that the 4 strands framework can also work for our skills lessons. And it may need a little bit of adaptation, but I think keeping in mind that same framework could be really useful. So for skills-focused instruction, some reading skills, probably the most common that we always see are the skimming and the scanning. It could even be just when to noticing different sections of readings, like how to read a science textbook versus how to read a novel, note-taking strategies for listening, or just hearing those segmentals. So instead of just hearing one block of text, being able to listen for the spaces between sections and paragraphs of speech. For writing, we have paragraph organization, capitalization rules, and speaking, turn-taking, negotiating meaning, participating in discussions. So all these skills that we also need to somehow cover in our classes. So if we have listening skills versus a writing skills, again, we can still use this same format and the same lesson arc. So stage 1, we have our meaningful input. This time, we're just going to use that text of choice. So for a listening lesson, we listen to podcasts. So maybe I'm just going to, again, choose a text that I'm going to be using this skill with, a podcast clip on a workplace topic. Note-taking, the skill I want to study is a main idea versus a detail. I want them to be able to summarize the clip to a partner from their notes because the notes are the important thing. But again, with that output, okay, why do we take notes? What do we want to get from our notes? Well, I take notes because I want to know the content of something. And so if I am able to summarize something, then that means I've identified the main ideas. So even just being able to think about when I have something that's an invisible process. So I cannot tell if my students are listening or not. Listening is invisible. So how can I make something visible? A summary is a production of being able to listen, receive something, and show that I can identify the main ideas. And then maybe for fluency development for listening, it's just going to be this rapid fire dictation relay. For a writing lesson, another type of skill, maybe I want to model email writing. So again, I'm going to start with my input, which is an actual email. I'm going to do that focused, explicit instruction for how am I organizing my paragraphs. Maybe I need to make sure that I'm putting my claims support. So my request, why am I making this request? Then for my output, because it's a writing lesson, I'm going to show that I can write an email. And then maybe for fluency, because I am just developing my writing fluency, maybe I'm just going to be doing a timed free write on a familiar topic because I don't want to have any new information. I just want to get at that writing fluency for my students. Okay, so for objections that if you bring this framework to your workplace, and you might get pushback because change is hard for people. I wanted to present a couple of objections that you might be getting. So first is, okay, we like PPP. We're familiar with PPP. PPP is comfortable. Isn't this just PPP with extra steps? And kind of, but this definitely keeps PPP's teachability because again, you have that structure and that framework, but it makes sure that you have a real input source that then you are using PPP with, and it's ensuring that you have a communicative output stage. And it also makes sure that you can give yourself some dedicated fluency work so that in your PPP, you might be putting in fluency where you have time, or you might forget about it, or you might think, oh, I'll push it to next week. But here you have a structure that's going to keep you accountable to make sure that you are structuring from receptive to productive, you're contextualizing your language, and you're supporting your students through all of the strands. Another objection, if you have some teachers who've been teaching for 10, 20, 30 years, they'll say, oh, isn't this framework just for novice teachers? I know how to teach. I'm sure they're doing great, but this could be a great curriculum audit. And it's also a great tool that they can use for mentoring newer colleagues. So this is a great thing that you can equip them with if they have been giving a new colleague to mentor or take under their wing. This could be something that could be really helpful as they are pursuing a mentoring process. Again, some people might say, well, Nation never intended this to be used this way. Maybe that's true, but this is a deliberate lesson level adaptation, and it is still consistent with using the strands to help you plan your curriculum. And we're still using it to make sure that we are balanced. You can definitely still use it for your whole curriculum course, but this is also a great way to make sure that your lesson itself is balanced. And if this does seem like it's more prep work, it really is a very reusable template. The structure is doing all of the thinking for you for your lesson plan. So you don't necessarily have to always think of how to structure your whole entire lesson and make it different every time. The content is going to be different every time, or maybe you might take fluency development and put it at the beginning of your lesson, or maybe you're going to do that one day a week and just kind of review the things that you've been learning without introducing new information. So there's still a flexibility, but it is also trying to make sure that everything is balanced for you. And hopefully take a little bit of the bandwidth of lesson planning, not making so exhausting. Okay. So 2 ways that you can use it after listening to me talk at you all night. Again, you can use this for your grammar, your vocabulary, even your pronunciation, as long as you have that that meaningful input that has the target language that you want your students to be using by the end of the lesson. So you have your input source, your target forms that you pull from the input, your PPP cycle mapped out, whether that's the boomerang or the patchwork or just straight through. You have your output task with a real purpose, and then your fluency activity. Or if you want to still use it for your skills, again, you have your input source, your target strategy, you're presenting the strategy, making that implicit or invisible metacognitive thinking visible, you're practicing it, the students are doing it, and then that output task, which has the students actually performing that skill, and then some type of fluency activity. So it works for both. So if you already have your curriculum all planned and mapped out, you can just retrofit. You don't have to rebuild everything. Take an existing PPP lesson or take an existing lesson that you have, see where you can slot it into these 4 strands, and then just add in any missing pieces, or even with your textbooks that you're using. Take a textbook, see what it's missing from their 4 strands. Maybe it has a great piece of input, but then it doesn't necessarily have a lot of that PPP. So maybe it has one controlled practice and then it immediately goes into a meaningful output activity. Well, you know that you're missing some steps there, so you know exactly what you need to add. So you can definitely retrofit your textbook into this too. You can use it as a checklist for yourself. And you can also use it for your syllabus design and department-wide planning conversations. So having just one shared template across all those skills areas, across all your levels. And that's all I have for you. So thank you again for joining me. I guess we're going to open it up for questions or discussion or